China will seek to erode away at the status quo or shift what its red line is. And so it's not just a matter of maintaining the same policy. China is always trying to find ways to probe and push and constrain Taiwan.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Nilo. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. If you're new to the podcast, be sure to check out our past episodes, which you can find on our blog site at pwnilo.com or by searching for Perspectives with Nilo wherever you get your podcasts. May 20th, 2024 marks the inauguration of the 16th term President and Vice President of the Republic of China, Taiwan. In the January election, Lai Ching-te, also known as William Lai of the Democratic Progressive Party, and his vice presidential running mate, Hsiao Bi-khim, won the popular vote. Their appointment to the presidential office means a third consecutive term for the DPP, as Lai's predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's first female president, concludes her 2 terms in office. This is a delicate time for Taiwan-China relations, as Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping has explicitly made taking Taiwan, by force if necessary, part of his plans to rejuvenate China. However, the Taiwanese people are less interested than ever in unifying with the mainland. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Brian Hioe back to the podcast. Brian is one of the founding editors of New Bloom magazine and a non-resident fellow at the University of Nottingham's Taiwan Studies program. I caught up with him in Taipei to talk about the upcoming inauguration, China's increasing grey zone tactics and overreach, the role of the China-friendly KMT party in the new administration, and much more. So, Brian, thank you for taking the time to talk with us, and you're very welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe I could start by asking about Lai Ching-te. He won the presidential election with over 40% of the vote back in January. His inauguration, together with Vice President-elect Hsiao Bi-khim, will take place on Monday, May 20th. What's the general feeling among the people of Taiwan as this event approaches? For example, I'm curious if this is a highly anticipated event, and how are inaugurations generally perceived by the public in Taiwan?
So I think the interesting thing about Lai is that people are not as enthusiastic about him as they were about Tsai. I think his inauguration is viewed as much more routine. There is an unprecedented aspect to his inauguration, which is that he is a third-term DPP president. So after the 2 terms served by Tsai Ing-wen, the public has decided to vote for another DPP president. So that is new, but even then, people are not as excited about him. I think he has vowed to maintain this similar policy to Tsai Ing-wen, but he's also not seen as charismatic in the way that she was, in the sense that he's not politically progressive, or he doesn't have any very distinguishing kind of characteristics of his political program. It's not after a massive movement like the Sunflower Movement in 2014, and so it is viewed as routine, but it does take place in a different political climate, in which China, for example, might react with military exercises or something of that sort.
So in a way, history, I guess, is being made here in that it's the first time for the DPP to hold the office for 3 consecutive terms. President-elect Lai Ching-te has also been announcing his new cabinet. So given it's another DPP president, are there many surprises in his new cabinet lineup, or is this more of a reshuffle?
So it's actually more of a reshuffle, because it does seem like there's a same set of familiar faces that the DPP is trying to rely on over and over again. And so you do see some returning faces from previous cabinets. The first premier, is Zhou Rongtai, who is not so well known publicly and has not as much been in the public eye, but is viewed as a steady hand with the DPP and is very well trusted within the party. Zheng Li-jing is the vice premier, and she was considered for his possible vice presidential candidate, but then passed over in favor of Hsiao Bi-khim. And she's more progressive, known as a former minister of culture, and does actually push him more in the progressive direction, because Lai is seen as more socially conservative in some ways. Then, as for other choices, there's some disputes or controversy about Ling Jialong becoming the foreign minister, because he doesn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. But then this is a concession for the internal party politics of the DPP regarding factions and who gets what position. And so that maybe shows that Lai may be very focused on keeping factions of the DPP happy, but not necessarily picking the best candidates, or at least that somehow some have read it that way.
Okay. And of course, Joseph Wu, who would be familiar maybe to many European listeners, he was previously the foreign minister. What is he going to be doing now?
So he's taking a position as the National Security Council head. And so that's a ministerial position, but National Security Council is sometimes viewed as Taiwan's analog to the CIA, and so it's an intelligence agency. So you often do see kind of movement between those two positions of foreign minister and National Security Council head. And in the meantime, Wellington Koo will be taking up a position as the Minister of Defense, which is also interesting because then he's a civilian taking up a military post. But Joseph Wu, as someone that has been very visible in the public eye in the past few years, taking up a post as the head of the National Security Council, may illustrate then that the Lai administration hopes for more attention to the National Security Council. For example, Lin Feifan, the former DPP's Deputy Secretary General, former Sunflower Movement leader in 2014, back when he was a student, is taking up a position as a vice head of the National Security Council.
Oh, that's very interesting. And generally, it seems so. These top names you mentioned very much focus on defense and security.
Yeah, that's right. Or that's what people are paying attention to. But the key names in that sense are often regarding these positions. So I think that does also show that the Lai administration is placing a great deal of weight on that. But then at the same time, they are the same usual faces that people have seen in different positions. And in particular, Ling Jialong, his previous portfolios were as the mayor of Taichung and as the Minister of Transportation and Communications. And so it is a jump actually to go to then foreign minister. And so people are a bit surprised by that. Some have not been as happy.
Okay. So while the DPP won the presidential race, they didn't maintain their majority in Taiwan's parliament or legislature. My understanding is that the power is split between the three main parties of the DPP, TPP, and KMT, and some independents as well. And also, of course, there's news that Han Kuo-yu of the KMT is the new legislative speaker. By all accounts, he's a pretty colourful character. How have things been progressing in this new legislature under Han?
So it's quite interesting, yeah, because the legislature is split. The KMT has a few more seats than DPP, but then the TPP, a newer third party, has 8 seats, and so it perhaps will then control the balance of power. But the TPP, while it has claimed to be a party that's beyond the traditional distinction between the KMT and DPP, has mostly voted with the KMT, and so that has actually led to the balance of power being towards the KMT. The KMT has used to frame this as having the majority support of Taiwan society, which is not really true because society is quite divided, and Lai did win the presidency after all. Yet with Han Kuo as the president of the legislature, it's been controversial because he was the KMT's 2020 presidential candidate. He often makes gaffes and is kind of a populist-style candidate. But then as the president, there were then criticisms that he would be overly pro-China because of the fact that he did meet, for example, with Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong chief executive, when he was running for office, and that he might just not have what it takes to be the president, because you do have to come to meetings on time rather than get drunk and miss the meeting, as occurred when he was the mayor of Kaohsiung on numerous occasions. And so as president of the legislature, he does have a crucial position. The KMT, though, has really mostly kind of assembled behind the caucus convener, Fu Quincy, who's also quite a colorful character that has a long history of political corruption. Notably, when he was the county commissioner of Hualien, when he was to be jailed on corruption charges, he divorced his wife, named her deputy county commissioner, so that when he was in jail, she became the county commissioner. And so he is actually the one that seems to be taking a very forefront role. Han is a bit of a puzzle. He doesn't actually always seem to go along with the party at large. So it could just be Han being unpredictable again, or a sign of splits within the party. It's very hard to tell from the outside.
In the past few years, Taiwan's parliamentary diplomacy under Yeo Shih-kun has been very successful in building connections with many countries, and there have been many visiting delegations from those countries to Taiwan, often at the displeasure of Beijing. Do you think this tradition of parliamentary diplomacy and outreach will continue under Han, particularly if it's likely to meet with disapproval in China's view, given his previous, as you mentioned, connections or bowing towards China, as it were?
It's a good question. The KMT does want to come off as not as pro-China as the international world does perceive it as. And so I think the KMT would not really turn down these meetings with parliamentary delegations, but it would not snipe at the connection that then Taiwan has built with such countries. For example, Hsiao Bi-khim, the KMT legislator from Taipei, who's a rising star in the party, actually, is one of the younger politicians in the party, has attacked, for example, a cooperation between Taiwan and Lithuania and Czechia to provide aid for reconstruction in Ukraine, saying that this is illicit deals, this is corruption, and trying to sink this relation in the sense that is strengthening by alleging corruption. And so that's one example of what might occur. Han will take a position as with regards to the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy as the chair, and that has long been a vehicle for outreach for Taiwan in terms of diplomacy to Europe, but also Southeast Asia. And so that's controversial, particularly for countries that fear the influence of China or human rights defenders that face threats from China, that might lead to some caution. And for example, the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy has conducted a lot of outreach with human rights defenders in Southeast Asia in past years, and so that might be an issue going forward.
And just from a practical perspective, I've heard some commentary about Han Kuo-yu's ability to speak other languages or his just general diplomatic style. What do you think about that? Is that just a red herring, or is he capable?
It's a good question, actually. It's a good question. The interesting thing is that he majored in English in college, and he has an English name, which is Daniel, which never gets picked up. So in theory, his English should be okay, but nobody's ever really seen him speak English. The same can be said of William Lai as well, though. For example, as the mayor of Tainan, he pushed for a bilingual policy, and yet he's never really been heard to speak English. This contrasts, for example, from Tsai Ing-wen, whose English is excellent and speaks English with a kind of British accent in some sense, because she did study in London. And then Hsiao Bi-khim, who is basically also an American, because she did grow up in America. And so these kind of language skills are something that the other parties perhaps are not as strong on currently.
Mm-hmm. And the KMT would appear to be working to build stronger ties with China as well recently. Former KMT President Lai Ching-te visited and met with Xi Jinping. And separately, a delegation of KMT lawmakers have also taken a high-profile trip to China. Perhaps if we talk about the visit by the delegation of lawmakers at the end of April first, what was the purpose of that visit, and did they accomplish anything?
So the interesting thing is that visit was also very much shaped by Ma's earlier visit. And so in that sense, that was also to reinforce the KMT's claim to be the only party in Taiwan able to talk with the CCP and negotiate and dial back cross-strait tensions. The KMT has long justified its claim to political power that it should be the political party in control of government on this basis. And so then after, for example, after that visit, there are various measures announced by China, such as that group tourism from Fujian province to the outlying island of Matsu could resume, or that there would be lifting of the bans on some agricultural and fishery products that were banned by China previously around the time that Nancy Pelosi came to Taiwan, such as pomelos. And so that did occur. It's another attempt to claim then or frame the KMT as able to secure these things or negotiate these things out of China in a way the DPP cannot.
And speaking of the tourism concession, I suppose that was granted, will the incoming Lai administration allow Chinese tourists to visit? I mean, I know there's been some issues with maybe spying and other things like that in the past. How do you think they will take that?
So it's interesting because the Lai administration would want to come off as willing to allow for Chinese tourists. That doesn't come off as targeting one country in particular or deliberately undercutting Taiwan's tourist industry, because there are tour operators that would hope to benefit from the influx of Chinese tourists, as Taiwan did see in the past. And so the Lai administration has called for then unconditional limits, not having these kind of conditions set by China attempting to coerce Taiwan to allow for group tourism to resume in that sense. And that's something that China is not allowed. At the same time, both sides have tried to put the blame on each other, and the Lai administration has also criticized when China, for example, unilaterally moved a flight route closer to the median line of the Taiwan Straits, saying that, well, because this happened, we don't want to allow for group tourism. And so it's kind of a push and pull, I think, right now at present, but it doesn't seem likely that it will resume anytime soon with the DPP in power. I don't think China will want for group tourism to resume in that sense, to continue to frame the Lai administration as being the one unwilling to negotiate. At the same time, if there were Chinese tourists, China could actually influence Taiwan economically in this way. So they are actually undercutting themselves in some ways.
It's interesting that, as you say, the KMT lawmakers visit China and straight away concessions are granted, bans lifted, making it look like they're very capable negotiators. Are China just trying to promote the KMT here, do you think? Or is there any signal to the Lai administration by Beijing that the door may be opening slightly for discussion with the DPP?
It's a good question. I think probably it's unlikely China be willing to talk to Lai. They will probably try to frame him as a pro-independence provocateur, going off of past statements when he was the mayor of Tainan, that he was a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence, quote unquote. And so that's expected to be the framing. I think China in particular will seek to work with the KMT and perhaps the TPP. The DPP, they are very interested in stonewalling, it appears.
Ma Ying-jeou also visited China, as we mentioned, at the beginning of April. He met with Xi Jinping. Ma also met with Xi about 10 years ago previously when he was the president of Taiwan. That was pretty significant back then that he met when he was president of Taiwan. Do you think the latest meeting holds any significance at all?
It's interesting because he did visit last year, and so this was, again, part of this claim to be the only party in Taiwan able to negotiate with China. But it's unclear how much this was in coordination with the other elements of the KMT. The current chair, for example, Eric Chu, historically was seen as more pro-American rather than pro-China. And now he's kind of changed position slightly because of the dominant trends of the KMT being the other way. But in the sense, Ma meeting with Xi shows that he's important enough that Xi would meet with him. And in some way that reinforces his standing in the party and his ability to influence the course of the party, to keep it on its more pro-China course, or not deviate in policy to try to seem less pro-China and more pro-American. And it is his visit then sets this precedent for Fu Quincy and the other KMT lawmakers of the subsequent delegation visiting in that sense, because he is a private citizen at present and not a elected lawmaker. So that doesn't mean his visit actually carries weight in policy, but then the KMT then still is able to meet with China and Chinese government officials. And so that's what the subsequent visit does show.
One of the recent KMT delegation to China is from Taiwan's outlying island of Jinmen. And she expressed that the goal of her visit was to secure the release of a Taiwanese fisherman who is being detained by China following an incident in the sea around Jinmen back in February. In a recent article you wrote for New Blue magazine, you mentioned that Taiwan's outlying islands seem to have taken on a new importance for China when it comes to attempts to influence Taiwan. Can you tell us more about the incident back in February with the fisherman and how this has been playing out since?
Yeah, that's right. So in February, there's an incident in which a Chinese fishing vessel, a speedboat with 4 people on board, was intruding in the territorial waters of Jinmen, one of Taiwan's outlying islands. And when the Taiwanese Coast Guard requested an inspection, it tried to flee and then crashed into the vessel and capsized. By the time that the 4 men recovered, 2 were without vital signs. And so that has led to further controversy. China framed it as aggression by Taiwan, though the boat was intruding in Taiwanese territorial waters, and claimed that harassment of Chinese fishermen by the Coast Guard, as directed by the Tsai administration, has been ongoing. After that, it began searching, for example, Taiwanese tourist vessels, which has happened several times. And in this way, when there was an incident in March when 2 fishermen from Taiwan blew adrift, their engine failed, and they ended up in Chinese territorial waters and were rescued. One of them was an active duty military officer, a 25-year-old man surnamed Hu, and so he has been detained by China since then. The other man that was in the vessel, a 40-year-old fisherman, was sent back. This active duty official now is in the process of being discharged by his family from military service, but then the KMT legislator of Jinmen, Chen Yuzhen, claims that she can help negotiate his release. And this is another attempt to say that, well, we're the only party that can communicate with China, and so we can allow for the kidnapped to get or arrested to be released quicker. And this has happened in past times when there were Taiwanese people detained by China.
But no release forthcoming at the present time.
That's right. Yeah, he was in the process of being discharged. And so no release seems forthcoming. It might be some time. It depends, really, I guess.
Okay. But this kind of behavior of China around Jinmen seems to have been escalating. I mean, last week there was 11 Chinese vessels were detected inside Taiwan's territorial waters, just a few kilometers from the coast of Jinmen. An unprecedented event. How so?
Yeah, I think it's one of those ways in which China has really tried to constrain Taiwan by stepping up gray zone tactics and warfare. So that has involved anything from intrusion to Taiwan's air defense identification zone, the area in which planes identify themselves for security purposes, to now naval vessels. And particularly the naval activity has increased a great deal since 2022 in August, when the drills that China conducted after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan took place. And that has now escalated with outlying islands of Taiwan, some of which are quite close to China. Jinmen, for example, you can see China's coastline with you're just with your regular looking out in the horizon.
So, but this latest set of events, I suppose, I don't believe China has officially responded to Taiwan's concerns about the incident. It was reported in the Chinese military online website that they posted a feature, what was called regular law enforcement patrols in water near Jinmen. But is there a strong expectation on the Taiwan government to take action as a result of this PRC overreach? Or do you think this is just behavior from China to be expected in the run-up to the inauguration of Lai Ching-te?
It's interesting because the people are not really panicking. I mean, that occurred with past drills on the scale of the August 2022 drills, which were massive and the largest since the Third Taiwan Straits crisis. The public did not react because just there has been so many exercises by China that people just have gotten used to it. And that has even occurred with regards to more recently with the outlying islands. And so that's actually a question. Is China actually able to manipulate public opinion or affect public opinion? It doesn't seem so at present. But when people, there's a sense of threat in Taiwan, but when people react, it's not often true because of the military drills. It's interesting, too, that even with the fisherman who's being held by China, there's not been strong reactions or many news reports, which has actually occurred in some other past cases in which Taiwanese were detained by China.
You also referred earlier, and in your New Blue magazine article, to other grey zone tactics that China is using to erode Taiwan's sovereignty. And for example, how China have announced the shifting of the M503 flight route in a manner that would take civilian flights closer to the median line of the Taiwan Strait. This is the second time they've moved this M503 flight path after previously adjusting it 6 nautical miles west in 2015 following discussions with Taiwan. On this occasion, it appears that there was no discussion with Taiwan. Can you tell us a little more about the significance of the shifting of this flight route and what it means?
Yeah, so I mean, particularly, it takes flights close to the median line of the Taiwan Straits, which historically was used as a kind of barrier by both sides to avoid the potential of conflict. But then for civilian flights, particularly if there is inclement weather, for example, they may pass closer, and that raises the pressure on the Taiwanese military to detect, are these civilian or are these military aircraft? And then that might force a quick response. It raises the odds of an accident occurring, which would involve a civilian aircraft. And so it does put civilians in line of fire. But if there were such an incident and the blame could be put on Taiwan, this would serve as a pretext for raising tensions. And so this is part of the reason why Taiwan has been quite unhappy about it. But also, Taiwan's inability to push back also does return to its lack of inclusion in international institutions that govern aviation safety, such as the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is under the United Nations. And so that's another challenge, I think, that Taiwan faces due to international exclusion.
Do you think the new cabinet that Lai Ching-te has put together will be any more effective in handling these issues than the previous administration?
Not particularly, because it is a lot of the same people in new positions. So I expect it to keep the same status quo as the Tsai administration. But then China will seek to erode away at the status quo or shift what its red line is. And so it's not just a matter of maintaining the same policy. China is always trying to find ways to probe and push and constrain Taiwan. And so that is expected to continue. So in some ways, the ball is not in the Lai administration or cabinet's court.
President-elect Lai Ching-te, he'll succeed Tsai Ing-wen, who is Taiwan's first female president. She was elected for 2 consecutive terms. What do you think are the main hallmarks of her legacy as her term now ends?
I think a lot of it has to do with the international ties that Taiwan has really developed under her tenure. Taiwan went from a place of comparative marginality or lack of reporting to somewhere that was focused on in the world as a potential geopolitical flashpoint. But then Tsai was able to really change international perceptions of the DPP in many ways, that she was not viewed as a pro-independence provocateur the way that Chen Shui-bian, her predecessor, was. And instead, she was viewed as maintaining the status quo, that she mostly kept a very low profile rather than doing any flashy big moves, and projected competence in that way to manage cross-strait relations without provoking China by coming off as the one that is more calm in many cases. And so in that sense, that has really changed things. I think that will be her main legacy. I mean, there are other accomplishments, for example, legalizing gay marriage or issuing an apology to indigenous on behalf of the state that would be viewed as domestic progressive political accomplishments. But then I think the largest impact will be this kind of change in international perception of Taiwan and the strengthened ties that Taiwan now has with other countries.
Do you think the number of women in politics has increased here in Taiwan since she became president?
It's actually a good question. I actually think probably not really. The interesting thing is that she is the first female president, but then there were already a number of women in the legislature, actually. It's still not the same as the number of men, but in terms of the world and representation, it's actually not too bad compared to other political systems. And so that has been a constant, though there are more female politicians maybe to some extent. But then within the cabinet, for example, the key positions, that has not really changed. There's still a lack of representation of women. And that's true of Tsai, and that's also true of Lai. And so that actually is maybe the challenge there.
Has she shared any information on what she will do moving forward?
She's kind of kept it open. The interesting thing is that because Taiwan has only had 3 democratically elected presidents, there are not a lot of templates as to what you could do once you retired. Li Denghui, the first democratically elected president, went off and retired and still kind of ran or was the spiritual leader of a third party. Lai Ching-te, after he left office, was quiet for a few years and came back and is now very active in politics. And so I think Tsai is more likely to follow the path of Ma and still be active in politics or be a factional figure in the DPP. She may take a position in terms of international representation for Taiwan because of the fact that she has all this attention internationally. she's indicated that she'd be interested in taking up such a role if called on to do so.
Well, certainly will be very interesting to watch that in the future. So.
Absolutely.
So, Brian, thank you very much for talking with us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you again.
Thanks for inviting me.
My thanks again to Brian Hioe for joining us on Perspectives with Nilo. And we've added links to Brian's articles and to New Bloom magazine, as well as additional information and references on the topics discussed in the interview on our blog site at pwnilo.com. With preparations in full swing for the inauguration in Taipei and many countries sending representatives, the world's attention will be on Lai Ching-te's inaugural address, and we plan to bring you coverage and updates on the celebration from the centre of the action. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on our social media pages so you don't miss out. But that's where we leave it for now. Until the next time, thank you for listening. Zai Tian.